From the medial geniculate nucleus, auditory information is sent to the auditory cortex, where a more complex analysis of the content of a sound is performed. Auditory cortex is also likely where the sound is perceived consciously, though the exact nature of conscious perception remains elusive and hard to study. The primary auditory cortex is located bilaterally in the temporal lobes, roughly near Brodmann areas 41 and 42. As a reminder, Brodmann areas are regions defined by their cytoarchitecture, basically how they look under a microscope, stained by different chemicals. They don't strictly correspond to functional divisions of the brain, but they comprise a useful reference frame, and scientists still use their areal nomenclature extensively. The structure of primary auditory cortex strongly resembles that of visual cortex. Much like area V1, the primary auditory cortex, A1, is organized in layers. Layer 1 contains few cell bodies, while layer 2 and 3 mostly contain small pyramidal neurons. Layer 4 is where axons from the MGN synapse, and it's densely packed with granule cells, while layers 5 and 6 again mostly contain pyramidal neurons, but they're smaller than those in layers 2 and 3. So how do these cortical neurons respond to sound? In primates, and presumably in humans as well, each A1 cell is tuned to a specific sound frequency in the audible spectrum. The tonotopic map that begins in the basilar membrane of the cochlea is carried through to the auditory cortex, forming columns of neurons that respond to similar frequencies. These columns are known as isofrequency bands. Low frequencies are analyzed by neurons at the rostral and lateral ends of A1, and high frequencies are analyzed by caudal and medial ends. We know quite a bit less about how auditory cortex works as compared to visual cortex, but it's clear that neurons in the auditory cortex have specific receptive fields, just like the cells in visual cortex. Except here, neurons respond to specific auditory features, in particular frequency ranges, rather than responding to specific visual features in specific regions of visual space. Cortical auditory neurons, similar to neurons in earlier stages of the auditory pathway, also encode information in different temporal response patterns. In addition to frequency tuning, some cortical auditory neurons are intensity tuned, meaning they preferentially respond to a particular sound intensity. Specialized neurons have also been found in auditory cortex that respond to very specific types of sounds, like clicking sounds, bursts of noise, frequency modulated sounds, and animal vocalizations. But in general, these cells are still poorly understood. In analogy to ocular dominance in vision, we also know that some auditory cortex neurons respond to just one ear, and others respond to inputs from both ears. Some are even inhibited when both ears are stimulated. Neurons that can sense differences in timing and intensity between the input from each ear probably play an important role in sound localization. Although A1 is the primary auditory region of the cortex, there are other highly specialized areas of cortex that receive auditory inputs as well. One of these is the second stage of auditory processing in cortex, area A2. Area A2 responds particularly well to things like phonemes, such as the elementary parts of words like ba and pa and da. As in other senses, the entire processing stream in audition is bilateral. That is, it's replicated on both sides of the brain. This gives the system some measure of resilience against damage. You can lose auditory cortex on one side and still be able to hear. Studies in human patients have shown that unilateral lesions only lead to a slight hearing loss. But bilateral lesions, which are fairly rare, lead to cortical deafness. This is a bit different from what's observed in visual cortex, where a total unilateral lesion of V1 would lead to complete blindness in one visual hemifield. Unilateral lesions in the auditory system tend to have a less disruptive effect on hearing because both ears send signals to cortical areas in both hemispheres.